LBC host James O'Brien is hardly amongst Britain's most radical political figures. But every now and again, he seems to get it. Almost.
Come here. Conspiracy theory. The closest I have ever come to a conspiracy theory was when Occupy Wall Street was kicking off. Do you remember when it really felt as if the status quo was under siege, that people were simply not going to tolerate a society in which some people have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds, and some people were using food banks. I reckon if you could plot those two timelines, the rise of Occupy Wall Street and calls for a really serious redistribution of wealth, just for a bit more fairness to be introduced into society, wealth taxes, all the rest of it, and the resurgence in racism when it comes to immigration, I think you'd see those two graphs were in lockstep with each other.
Almost clicking. So why is that a conspiracy theory? Look, we know at least one thing about the circumstances that give rise to both calls for wealth redistribution and anti-immigrant sentiment, and that's the presence of scarcity. Scarcity in housing, scarcity in access to the NHS, scarcity in well-paying jobs, and scarcity in security in general. Now, the Occupy movement arose in response to the 2008 financial crash and the economic austerity inflicted on populations by governments who used public funds to bail out a casino financial sector. So essentially, ordinary people were forced to pay for those bailouts to private capital by seeing the services that they relied on degraded or removed. And current calls for wealth redistribution in the form of wealth taxes come hot on the back of a massive hike in wealth inequality in the UK, largely caused by the wealthy accumulating assets and capital during the pandemic. Again, that was done through public money, with government furlough cash making its way into the pockets of the rich through rents and purchases, and then taken back from the public through tax rises and, again, cuts to public services. But is there a more direct connection between the super wealthy and anti-immigrant sentiment? This was friend of the show Gary Stevenson of Gary's Economics on Channel 4 earlier this month.
I never thought I would have to be talking about immigration. I'll be totally honest with you, I'm not an expert on immigration, right? That's not something that you learn about. You study economics at university. I've never considered it to be like a massive driving factor behind the UK economy. But I started to see about like 2 years ago, it coming in really aggressively, like, no, it's not the rich. The problem's not the rich. The problem is immigrants. The problem is immigrants. And at first it was a bit, and then it was a bit more, and then it was a bit more. And I was kind of thinking, where is this coming from? But I realized we're getting to a situation, I think we are in a situation now, where the number one thing which is preventing higher taxes on the rich is basically anti-immigrant sentiment. And that worried me because I realized immediately, I'm almost wary of saying this, if the rich find out that the number one thing preventing them from paying higher taxes is dislike of immigrants, they will start absolutely funding the shit out of it.
He said, funding the shit out of it there. Channel 4 bleeped it out. Now, you might think, as James O'Brien seems to, that sounds a little bit conspiratorial, you know, the rich funding anti-migrant sentiment. But Gary brought some receipts.
I feel okay saying this now. I didn't want to say it before because I didn't want rich people to be like, let's fund anti-immigrant sentiment. Let's fund anti-immigrant sentiment. The reason I feel okay saying it now is because we've got Elon Musk. You've got Elon Musk coming in, richest man in the world, aggressively supporting and funding anti-immigrant sentiment. And it makes total sense because if you're smart, you know that this economic situation gets worse. And it will. I guarantee you, it will get worse and worse and worse, significantly worse for ordinary people. And then you know we will have to have some sort of significant political change. And I think there are basically two leading voices in what we need to do. There's me and my lot saying tax the rich, but there's another voice which is much, much louder, which is the problem is immigrants. And if you are a billionaire, which one of those two do you want to win? So I'm not surprised at all to see Elon Musk coming in and really aggressively funding the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants.
Look, as every single politician knows, and as every person who's grown their wealth by fleecing ordinary folk truly understands, there is nothing more dangerous than a united working class. That's why you've got to divide it up all the time. You've got to create infighting. You've got to create opposition within that bloc in order to keep it electorally dysfunctional or electorally impotent. Here's one last bit from Gary.
I think we have to accept that large levels of immigration may have affected, especially some groups of society negatively. And I come from a poor background and I went to London School of Economics, very fancy university. I went to Oxford, I work in the city, I work in media now, like I published a book. These are all like very, upper middle class spaces. If you allow to migrate, for example, a lot of manual workers, this affects the middle class who, professor at university. If a load of plumbers and builders come in, and you're a university professor and you want a kitchen renovation, that affects you differently to somebody who is a plumber or a builder. And I think there's sometimes a frustrating lack of class awareness on this. I think we have to accept it. It will have affected some groups differently than others, and it might have affected some groups negatively. I think we have to accept that. But I don't think it's the main cause. I don't think it's the main cause. The group of society which is getting massively richer is the rich. It is the super rich. These guys are getting really, really, really aggressively richer. And I think they are kind of cynically using this. I think they know. And for me, my plan is to unite the working class, to push back on this group of society that is taking their houses. And if people can be convinced to hate migrants, and in the extreme case, to hate people of colour, that makes my job impossible. Because the British working class is extremely multiracial, multi-ethnic. So I really, really worry about this narrative growing and growing.
I think there's a point there that Gary makes about how immigration may have affected some groups in society negatively, to the point that I think we maybe don't often want to make, as well as he says that there's a lack of class awareness about that, which I think is true. I think that's a really important one. And I think you can say that. Yeah, some parts of society have not benefited from immigration, while also saying that immigration has been an overall net economic positive for the UK, which is also true. It just means that the economic benefits of immigration, as with all things in a fundamentally unequal society, are distributed very unevenly across its parts. Helena, what did you think about what Gary said there? And do you think James O'Brien, if you watch that, he might finally get it?
So when it comes to the immigration effect, there are plenty of things that we can do to mitigate its negative effects. As you said there, it can have effects if certain numbers of immigrants come and take certain kinds of jobs and certain sectors of society, which increases the supply, therefore reduces the actual value in relation to a similar amount of demand. Broadly, immigrants come into this country and take all kinds of jobs. They don't really have a labour market distortion in the way that a lot of people try to say that they do, because they increase demand and increase supply by being consumers as well as being labourers as well. And of course, the more working age people we have, the more people we have to pay pensions. If you didn't have migrants, there'd be loads of the taxation on the people who might be getting slightly higher wages before these labour market distortions. They're going to have to pay lots more in tax because there's fewer other people paying tax to fund the number of pensions that we have that isn't going down. That's only increasing over time. Obviously, you can take actions to be able to mitigate this, like a sectoral bargaining agreement. If we had proper sectoral bargaining like they have, for example, in Nordic countries, if there was a labour market distortion because a certain kind of migrant was coming here that took a certain type of job in the economy, a sectoral bargaining agreement smooths out that labour market distortion, that wage arbitrage that you get by saying, builders or plumbers, which actually we don't get that many. It's still actually a pretty lucrative career to work in the trades at this point, because a lot of people are coming and they're doing things in the service industry, which wages have been depressed. I think that if you had a sectoral bargaining agreement and you had more trade union membership, that would protect wages from the kind of distortions that you see from migration. But more to the point, with regards to James O'Brien, the thing is that the description of a conspiracy theory is this idea that anything that we can cause in a liberal mind is being caused through a direct desire to make it happen. Something's being directed. There's a puppet master in the background. That's what a conspiracy theory looks like through the liberal analysis of how change happens in the world. There are people who are pulling strings, who are making deliberate decisions to distort how the political system functions. When in reality, if you look at this from a materialist perspective, then you understand that this isn't about somebody making deliberate decisions. This is about a competing set of conflicting material interests. And that's what he sort of touched on there, and saying, well, look, the rich might have got taxed a little bit more. We might have been a little bit more redistributive if the Occupy Wall Street moments, if the anti-austerity movement in this country from 2010 onwards had been stronger, and it wasn't divided, as Gary so eloquently put there, by getting people to fight amongst each other by race rather than by class. So there's a really important understanding there that this is not being done because there is an evil person in the background deciding to make it happen. Elon Musk is evil, of course, but the idea that he's doing things for his own material interest is treated like a conspiracy rather than a natural reaction to a entirely over marketized economy where all that matters to people is their own material circumstances, where we look at the people who've maintained all this wealth, who've created all of this wealth in their own hands, rather than having it distributed for the benefit of all of society. And in a world where we've taught people that greed is good, I think, well, I've got to protect this. I have to make sure that my net worth stays as high as possible. And so that's a material interest of theirs to maintain that. So they want to push back by ensuring that there is a political movement that stops any amount of distortions to how they want to maintain the wealth that they've accrued through this current economic system to try and halt that change. That's not a conspiracy. That is just people looking after their own material interests. That is the nature of the conflicts under capitalism, So it's not a conspiracy to be able to claim that that's happening. And I'm glad that James O'Brien is starting to recognize this. It's interesting that just after the American election, he was like, I was surprised. He was very surprised to find out that the main thing that was driving people towards Trump was how expensive petrol was rather than, the state of American democracy. And that's because at the end of the day, material conditions matter. But it doesn't just matter for people on the bottom. It also matters for people at the top as well. Their material interest is extracting as much wealth as possible from the proletarians who they take surplus value from. And any way to change that through extra trade union bargaining or higher wages or through higher taxation going into the public realm has to be pushed back. And they will fund media to do it, which will also manufacture consent for policy against trying to ensure that there is a more equitable distribution of resources in our society. And that is just the natural result of the system as it is. And so you have to change the system rather than trying putting better people at the top or trying to change the way in which we narrativize it. You have to make sure the system changes. And as Gary was correctly put, that involves class solidarity. That involves building a coalition of people with the same material interests and trying to get them to unite under that banner without being distracted by the ways in which the people who have the other set material interests from dividing and conquering, which has been part and parcel of history. I mean, they literally did this in the Americas, in the United States of America, when they ended slavery. There was a deliberate desire by the bourgeois in American society to push the narratives around racial narratives. So it's rather than there being common cause between the recently freed slaves and the working class proletarians within American society at the time, but they should have class unity. They are now part of the same class, having slavery been ended. But there was plenty of propaganda that was successful to try and pit the white working class people against the black newly freed slaves. And this is the same kind of racist narrative that we see being parroted right now to try and stop there being class unity. And that's the job that we have here on the left. As what Gary Stevenson talked about in the podcast episode that we just watched there, is trying to make sure that we go past the cultural distractions of what's being pushed by the anti-immigrant sentiment from the right and try and speak about material class unity and class consciousness. And that, as far as I'm concerned, should be our main mission moving forward.